Think of a time when you experienced a conversation that left you with a new perspective, or perhaps an inquiry, or you might have felt that something has shifted in you after that conversation. Maybe it helped you gain a new level of clarity, or moved you to take action. That was a coaching conversation.
Hello and welcome to the Coaching Conversation podcast. This is your host, Salah Aliki, and I'm really excited to have with me today Brandi Olson. Brandi is an author and a writer and a coach. She is an organizational agility expert and founder of Real Work Done consultancy, serving leaders through agile transformation, organizational strategy, team design, and executive coaching. Brandi has spent nearly 2 decades consulting with organizations across diverse sectors, from nonprofit to universities, global Fortune 50 companies. I'm really honored to have her with me today. Brandi, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So I want to first congratulate you on your new book, Real Flow. Great title, great concept and focus. I'm a big fan of flow-based concepts, and this is something that's needed in today's work environment. So let me start by saying congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to have it here and get to actually be talking about it and getting input and feedback and dialogue and conversation. So when you're writing, you kind of, at least I wind up sitting in a room by myself for a while. And so actually having it be part of the conversation now is just so delightful. So thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. So I want to start by asking about how did you end up in this type of work? What's your story? How did you get here? And then we'll explore some of the concepts in the book and how to apply them.
So my journey is definitely not a linear one, and it's one that's got lots of forward and backward loops. But my early career, where I first started working, was actually in education. So used to be a licensed public education teacher, and I taught middle school and high school special ed. And while I was teaching, somewhere along the way, I read an article about agile retrospectives. And I'd never heard the word agile before, and I didn't know what a retrospective was exactly, except that as I started reading, I recognized really, really quickly that they're talking about software development, but actually they're talking about how do we solve complex challenges with people at the center, where things are changing all the time and we have to be learning really fast. And I recognized really quickly that this is my world as an educator and as a teacher. And I just dove right in and started to embrace and learn as much as I could about what agility meant and how to bring that into my classroom, and did everything that I could in embracing and integrating agile practices with my education practice and in my school. And that's where I really fell in love with agility, and in particular with the idea of how do we design ourselves for learning, which is something that I'd always been really passionate about as a teacher, is how do we take the experiences that we're having, understand what we're learning from them and adapt, but how do we design ourselves together so that we can learn faster? So that was the beginning of my agile coaching career. I didn't know it at the time. But then from there, after I stopped teaching, I started working with organizations around how are we learning and how do we adapt and how do we design professional development opportunities and learning experiences so that we grow together. But as I was doing that, I was using agile practices and asking tricky questions like, well, how do you know this is going to work? And what are we really after here? And how will we recognize that the things we did in this workshop are actually going to lead to the change that we want? And I kept asking lots of those questions, and I kept getting invited to help solve different kinds of problems with the organizations that I was working with. And that led me into the consultancy and coaching career that I've had. I now work with a wide variety of organizations inside technology and outside of technology around that question of how do we design ourselves to be responsive to change. The thing that I always come back to that continues to be a really core part of my work and has always been part of my journey is that learning question. And I think that in 2022, how we organize ourselves and how we work together as an organization to learn and how fast we can learn together about how to improve is really the competitive advantage and the value that any organization can offer. And so that question of what are we learning and how do we apply it still is central and core to my practice and how we think about the ways that we work together and what we're accomplishing.
Learning is key in that, as you said, designing for learning and having a teaching background, having experience with how to design for learning and responding to change and making this impact is applicable whether you're working with students or a team or an organization or an executive, it's very much aligned with what we try to do with organizations. Fun fact, I had my last guest also came from a teaching background. She taught at high schools before she started doing the organizational and human systems design. I think that the book title and the concepts of flow that you're introducing, and I know the book is available now for pre-sales.
Released October 5th.
Just around the corner.
Yeah.
The title is Real Flow, but there is also this subtitle, which is Break the Burnout Cycle and Unlock High Performance in the New World of Work. So I want to start first by asking what inspired you to write this book, and then we can look into like when did you first notice some of the patterns that you wrote about in the book?
So the book came out of years of teaching and working with leaders and teams around how do we design ourselves to be a more effective team? But then as a leader, how do I set that team up for success? And I found myself over and over again teaching about prioritization, teaching about what a work in progress limit is and how do we understand our work in progress and what that means for us and how do we choose it? And in particular, how do we as humans and individuals show up to that work? And when we spend, our days multitasking and context switching and trying to wrestle with an immense amount of competing priorities, what's that actually doing to us? And, one of the themes that comes up over and over again, anytime you are working in an organization is that there's an abundance of important work to do. And that means that there's usually an abundance of competing priorities, things that are all important, need to be all done right now. And it feels nearly impossible to prioritize any further than saying they're all number one priorities. Get them all started because we have to get them all done. But that comes right in conflict with the reality that we are also very human selves. And there is an actual limit to how much we can do at any given time. And so I would teach that and talk about that and draw pictures on the wall and graphs about how do our brains work and respond to this? Because turns out there's a pretty high tax to pay for that context switching and those competing priorities. So I was doing a lot of teaching around this. I actually had a talk that I gave at a few conferences a while back, and I was super passionate about what I call organizational multitasking and context switching. And I actually had a friend ask me one time, he said, Brandi, why do you care so much about multitasking and context switching? Like you were more excited and passionate about this than anybody I know, and I don't understand why you care so much about it. And I paused and I had to really, really think about it. And that is when I understood what the book was about and what I actually wanted to write about. And what I told him was, I care so much about it because too often we being organizational leaders and organizations put people in positions where they have to choose between doing good work and their own humanity and well-being. And I think in the vast majority of situations, that's a false choice that we force people to make, that you don't have to choose between showing up and doing good work and sacrificing your own well-being in the process. You don't actually have to make that choice, except that the way most of our organizations are designed, the way we most often prioritize or don't prioritize, puts people in the position where that is exactly what they have to choose between. And it's a false choice. And I think it's costing us a lot of good people and it's diminishing what we're capable of. And so that's where I started to understand that this is really about how we work together as people and how we burn each other out or we burn ourselves out and experience burnout because of the culture of competing priorities, too much work in progress. And we don't solve that problem. So we wind up burning out and having a lot of turnover and having diminished outcomes. And there's just a lot of good work that needs to be done in the world. And I think that we're missing out when we work in that way. So that's how the book came to be. That's how I understood that it's not really a book about multitasking. It's really a book about how, while we experience burnout as individuals, it's not an individual problem. It's happening because of the way that we're choosing our work together, and that there are some really concrete things we can do differently that are going to have a really different outcome.
I thought about this metaphor in the past. The only time or place that juggling really works is in the circus, right?
Yes.
But in reality, whether it's organizations or individuals, it has a toll on how we work. And not just at work, where that might be another area to explore today, not just at work, the place of work, let's call it, because now work is everywhere.
It adds to the challenge sometimes.
And so not just to the place of work, but it spills over to our personal life as well. And it has probably consequences and price on the well-being of people, individuals, and mental health. And that will reflect back on, like you said, not doing good work or showing up with very low or limited energy to give back.
I tell this story in the book, but as the pandemic was starting to unfold back in 2020, I was working with an organization at the time and a really thoughtful leader who was leading multiple teams. So leading kind of a largish part of her organization. And she really very much cared about the people who were on her team and the work that they were trying to accomplish. This was a data analytics firm. And she asked me in one of our coaching sessions, she said, okay, I know that like anybody who has kids now has those kids at home and they're not in school. And like we're all experiencing a tremendous amount of stress. How much capacity reduction should I plan for my team was her question, right? Should I think that like they'll spend 20% of their time more on home things? And, so maybe we'll only have 80% of their time at work. Like I really want to plan for it. She had the very best of intentions, but like even in the question, right? Like we can hear that and think, but we're just all one whole human, right? We don't actually get to divide ourselves into percentages and parts. And that's part of the problem is we try to do that all the time, but humans aren't slices of pie. We aren't percentages of ourselves. So we're one whole human trying to figure out how to like care for our family and crisis and unrelenting change at home, figuring out new ways of working, all of these things. And so what I told her was, I said, I have no idea. Like any given day, who knows how much of what's happening at home is going to impact what's happening at work? Probably a lot, probably every single day. So what I told her is like, I have no idea what the percentage is. I think that's not a really great use of your time to try to figure that out. But what you can do is make sure that you as the leader are extraordinarily clear on what the next thing that the team needs to get done is, right? Like what is the next prioritization? And then the one after that, and make sure that you're being really clear around the outcomes that you need so that everyone else can organize around them. And so that what they are able to bring to work, the time that they do have to collaborate to focus on work, they're laser focused on the thing that matters most, right? Whatever that is. And you as the leader need to make that super clear. And that's a much better use of your time than trying to figure out some magical capacity utilization formula for how to show up in a pandemic and work.
That makes sense in terms of like, as humans, we're holistic, we show up holistically. And if we divide our attention or in percentages, that usually tend to create what you explained earlier about like multitasking and trying to juggle a little here, a little there. And then at the end of the day, we don't really have anything done because, we're working on so many things and nothing is getting to the finish line. So I don't know if this is the right metaphor, but I want to offer this and then let me know if this resonates with this theme of the book or the concepts. Gardening, for example, like you're trying to take out the things that are sucking the nutrients of the plants, like the weeds, and then nurturing the sort of like the plants. So burnout seems to be like the things that suck up the energy and cause disruption in the flow. And then the actual nurturing is when we start to get into the flow. Is that how you might look at it, or is there a different way to look at this?
Well, I love that metaphor. And I think it's really interesting to kind of explore. I think that there's two kind of dimensions to burnout. One we talk about a lot and one we don't often talk about a lot. The one we tend to talk about a lot is what we each experience, right? The individual experience of burnout, what it feels like to be burned out, to be, beyond just exhausted, but to, physically have that impact our well-being. And those of us who have experienced that or getting close to that, we know what that feels like. The other side of burnout that we don't often talk about is like, what really are the root causes of it, right? Or what's happening in the organizational environment that we're working in. And to be clear, I want to talk about like burnout at work. There are a lot of reasons why we experience stressors and burnout and in our whole human lives, and they don't all have to do with work. But when we're talking about burnout in the world of work, there's been a lot of research looking at like, why does this happen, right? And Gallup is an organization that's done a ton of research on this, and they consistently find that people experience burnout, report that they have overwork, too much overtime, that the way their managers, engage with them leads them to feeling too much pressure. And that those are really pretty persistent themes in terms of why people burn out. So then we have to look at like, well, what's happening in the organization? And that's where I think the garden metaphor can really help us and understand that like, just like in a garden, you might be looking at a tomato plant, right? And understanding, right? I've got tomato plants out in my garden right now in Minnesota. And I'm so excited because it's always this time of year that we hope we have enough sunlight and warmth for them to like really grow and get lots of ripe tomatoes. So I might be looking at a tomato plant and I'm trying to understand like, is this plant healthy or not, or why isn't it? But what the reason that plant is healthy or not is not just because of the individual plant, right? It's the soil that it's in, it's the ecosystem that's around it, it's the bugs and the microbes that are in the soil. It's what plants are next to it. It's what happened to that plant months ago when it was first germinating, right? Like there's a lot of factors. It's not just a linear relationship between put plant in the ground, water plant, and it will grow and thrive. That's overly simplistic. That's often kind of how we think about what's happening in organizations too, like that it's just somehow this linear cause and effect thing. But in reality, there's a lot of factors at play and what makes a plant healthy and thriving or not healthy, or what makes an entire garden, right, healthy or not healthy. And that's where I think we can really learn a lot by stepping back and looking at our organizations in that way and understanding how something like the way we choose our work and the way it flows through our organization, does everything just get pushed into the queue so that we have to start it all and try to make progress on all of it at the exact same time? That's going to result in a really stressed ecosystem of human beings trying to do good work? Or are we able to find ways to control the flow of work so we're not just out of control all the time, but we control the flow of work. We pull it in as we're ready to take on new things, and we work within, our boundaries. Understanding that we operate a whole lot more like a garden ecosystem than a, machine that creates widgets is going to lead us to looking at a problem like burnout really differently. And I think that's what we need to do more of. We need to look at a challenge like individual burnout in an organization through the lens of an entire ecosystem, not just through the lens of like inputs and outputs.
I love how you expanded on this metaphor. I saw like a picture on Twitter at one point about like the metaphor like forest, where like you explaining the ecosystem, and then how we think about it as you described as like this plant in its own pot on its own. So when we look at it's more like the organization is more around like the ecosystem and how things are happening, not just at what's visible, but also what's invisible under the soil, as you mentioned. So one of the things I want to explore is now that the burnout, how do you know, what are some of the signs? And I know you mentioned the Gallup survey about overwork and having sort of like getting too much pressure from leadership to deliver. What are some other signs that you've experienced or seen in your work? And how do you look for them? Is there a way to just say, okay, this sort of like looks like there's a lot of burnout happening on this team or in this organization?
I think there are a lot of early indicators and early signs that perhaps the system of our organization or our team is not leading us towards thriving. And again, it's, are we looking at it from me as an individual? If I'm looking at burnout as an individual and my role on a team or in an organization, and I'm experiencing that burnout, then I'm going to make choices individually that probably are better for me, but don't necessarily align to the goals of the organization, right? If I'm being forced to choose between showing up and doing good work and my own well-being, eventually, I'm probably going to choose my own well-being. And rather than stick around and try to help you understand why I got so burned out, I'm going to raise my hand and say goodbye and go to another job, right? We're seeing that all the time right now. Yeah. But if I'm a leader of a team, or I'm a leader of a division, or I'm a leader in an organization, or perhaps I'm a coach that is looking at a whole team, there's so much that we can see as signs and indicators that our system is either thriving or perhaps our system and our organizational ecosystem is degrading, right? And starting to fall apart. And I think some of those things start really early. One of the most reliable is a strong word, but one of the most active indicators of an organizational ecosystem or team that's really struggling and maybe at risk for experiencing burnout is just looking at calendars. How many back-to-back meetings are we in all day long? How long does it take us to bring the right group of people together in order to have a conversation? And when that conversation happens, how many people are there versus not there, right? How hard or easy is it to get the right people into the right conversation at the same time? That's challenging in your organization right now. Then that is an indicator, right? That's a system indicator that you are experiencing some level of what I would call flooding. When we are just overwhelmed by competing priorities, by by critical, important work happening all at the same time, by, that organizational multitasking kind of flood, right? And one sign of flooding is it shows up in our calendars. And if we're not taking the time to look at that when that's happening, that most definitely is just a top level indicator of a whole lot more that's happening underneath the surface, or kind of just on top of the surface, right? Maybe not even underneath the surface. That the way that we're working together is causing a lot of strain on our own human cells, our own human brains, and our own, human bodies. We're under duress if that's the norm in the culture around working.
I think calendars are definitely a place to look when you're noticing a lot of burnout, or people are missing in terms of showing up to some of the meetings because they're overbooked or double booked or triple booked sometimes because they're working on so many projects at the same time. So
there was some interesting research that the Microsoft Human Factors Lab conducted over the last year and a half. And so this is a lab that looks at those human factors at work. How do we work together? What they did is they actually looked at the effect of back-to-back meetings on human bodies and brains through brain scans. And so they looked at, and they did brain scans on the participants in the research study after every meeting. I think they were wearing electrodes is what they were doing. They were measuring electrical activity and stress hormones in the brain. And what they found was that after just 4 back-to-back meetings of 30 minutes each, so it's just a 2-hour chunk of time, that by the second meeting, the number of the increase in electrical activity and increase in stress hormones was almost double from the first meeting. And then it continued to exponentially rise over the course of those 4 back-to-back meetings. So by the time you got to the third and the fourth meeting, our brains and our bodies are just flooded with stress hormones, which for many of us starts to feel normal, right? We're like, well, that's kind of, that's just normal for me. But it's not normal for our bodies. We get comfortable at this higher baseline of just activated nervous system and activated stress in our brains and our bodies. And then we operate at that higher level of stress, which doesn't lead to more productive outcomes. It feels like we're working really hard, but there's not a correlation between increased stress hormones in the brain and better outcomes or productivity. In fact, it's a reverse correlation. In the same study, they looked at, okay, well, what's the impact of having breaks between each meeting? And so then they looked at 10-minute breaks between each meeting and found that had really dramatic impact on reducing overall stress hormones and electrical activity in our brain, and allowed us then to rebound to the next meeting. So even if you think about how does that translate to a group of people or a group of people? It's that when we are operating in an environment that's just a constant level of brain stress, then you add to the relational stress of just constantly not being in where you need to be and having more and more people who are depending on you, and you're having to choose who do you say no to today. That adds relational stress. So then our baseline of stress just jumps way up. And of course, when our nervous system is activated like that, when our body is stressed like that, when our brain is stressed like that, we put a lot more energy into managing the stress and to managing how we are feeling in that, whether we choose to or not. We don't have a choice in it. It's like an automatic response of our body, right? So we just are. And we're not putting as much energy into quality conversations, good decision-making, understanding the data, looking for new insights. We're not doing those things when we are constantly just managing the context switching and managing the higher levels of stress in our body. So then you start to think about okay, so what happens when we have an entire team or entire organization of people who are operating at that level? And it doesn't take long to see that the garden ecosystem isn't super healthy, right? It's not going to produce the best tomatoes and the, brightest flowers. It's going to produce something less than what it's actually capable of. And that happens over and over again in organizations that we all probably know and love.
A lot of time, I'm using this expression, I'm borrowing this expression from someone, I can't recall exactly who, but it's like time thieves, things, a lot of waste that take away a lot of the focus, almost like there's this sort of tendency to create motion as a sign of progress. I wonder if you have some thoughts on why this happens, what's causing all this keeping busy and keeping things going when we know it's not really healthy for the individual or the organization or the team.
I've thought about that a lot, and I've researched it a lot, and I continue continue to like look and listen and try to understand why do we keep working in ways that are so antithetical to how humans do good work? And I think there's a few things that happen. I think one is I've never met a leader who would deny that focus is good, right? I've never met anybody who's like, focus is bad, multitask everywhere, right? Like we don't do that. I think there's cognitively, we understand that like, yes, focus is good. Yes, we need to have clarity around our prioritization. However, I think that we also get overwhelmed by the flood of important work to do. And we feel that focus is a luxury we can't afford, that the only way to get through all of the work is to just plow through it. And that there's no other path forward. And so when we start talking about well-being or reducing burnout, I think that many of us, that triggers for us some like kind of key insecurities and questions like, are you going to tell me I need to do less? Are you going to tell me I need to lower my expectations? Are you going to tell me that I just need to choose more things to say no to? And immediately our barriers go up because doing less isn't an option. Lowering my expectations is not an option. I'm a high performer. I'm not going to lower my expectations, right? Or perhaps we're in the situation where we feel like we've already said no to 1,000 things that are not as important. So what we are left with is all critical, all important. So now what, right? So we put up these barriers, and I think that in the mix of all of that, we've got these really strong, I call them like cultural illusions. They're because they have the appearance of seeming true. That if I am in meetings all day, I must be important, right? If I am super busy, then I must be important. If I'm exhausted at the end of the day, that means I've worked hard. There's a lot of like myths and cultural ideas around how we value busyness, particularly in Western cultures, particularly in American culture, that doesn't necessarily translate to European cultures, but it gets us all, like it shows up everywhere for all of us. And so I think we feel that, or we get caught up in the illusion that, multitasking is the only way, that we can't afford focus, and that, being exhausted and being burned out is just the price we have to pay to be a high performing leader or team or organization. And so we like all those messages kind of pile on top of us, and we're in meetings all day. We're working on multiple things at the same time. And there's something really interesting that's happening in our brain when that's going on. And this was a real aha moment for me when I learned it, which is the same part of our brain that is responsible for context switching all day and managing that queue of all of the tasks and things we need to do. The same part of our brain is called the executive functioning capacity of our brain, is also the same part of our brain that is responsible for shifting perspective and experimenting with new ways of working. And what's true about the executive functioning part of our brain is it can only do one thing at a time. So our brains can literally not context switch and look at the way that we're working and try to figure out a better way to do it. It's just not possible in our brain. And so we get these like this big milieu of like messaging and illusions around busyness and importance and what productivity ought to be. We're stuck in it all. And even though cognitively we might know that there's a lot of research that says this isn't the way to do it, we continue to move forward because we're just kind of stuck in this flooded cycle of doing the very next thing. So I think it's really challenging. It's really challenging to break out of those illusions, especially if you feel like breaking out of it means lowering your expectations. There's not like that value proposition just isn't very strong. I don't think that's what it has to be. And I don't think that that's what the research would support, but I think that's what we believe.
That's a great insight, especially for team coaches or agile coaches who work with teams and trying to help teams improve some of the work that they do, but the team is constantly busy and they're just focusing on doing work, right? So as you said, like they can only focus on doing work, but not improving the work, right? And when you're trying, or a coach is trying to help the team improve, they're like, we don't really have time for improvement because we're trying to do the work, right? I mean, we often see this picture of like, people pushing a barrel that has like square wheels and, someone else trying to hand him like round wheels and like, we're busy. We can't change that. But yeah, that's a wonderful insight how this plays out in terms of improvement. Can't improve if you're constantly busy doing things, right?
Right. Well, it's one of the reasons why I think that like structure of a sprint becomes really beneficial, because if you have a time and a place that you've already set aside to look at the way that you're working and to find ways to improve it, then that's like baked in to your cycle, right? So the idea of a retrospective or a sprint review, both of those things really help us because they give us a time and a place to look at the way that we're working. working and find ways to improve. But if you look outside of like the team structure, even in an organization that's been practicing and using agile frameworks and practices and principles for a long time, a lot of times that structure just only lives within the team. And so then you level up and say, well, okay, how is a team of teams, or how is a leadership group who's also flooded with tremendous amount of pressure and competing priorities? They often don't have baked in times and places to look at the way that they're working, the way the organization is functioning, and to find ways to adjust and improve. And so while some of those practices exist within perhaps an agile team, they don't exist in the rest of the organization. And so then we're limited in what's possible because we just continue to get flooded by that immense pressure to do it all at the same time.
Part of my work is coaching one-on-one with individuals or team members or leaders. And to your point earlier, a lot of time they're trying to delegate things to others, right? And as you pointed out earlier, this sort of, when I dig deeper, I find that like what we call like saboteurs or inner critics, if I delegate and my time, frees up, then I might not be important enough. If my schedule is not packed all the time, if I'm, if I'm not in meeting all day, then I may not, be important enough or good enough, or I am not doing enough. And those sort of things that internally the leaders or even individual contributors, they think about a lot. So they're not willing to give up what they're doing because that gives them a sense of this sort of importance or productivity.
Yeah, the risk feels high.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. The thing that comes up, I see that happening a lot too. And I think that's one of the reasons why, I wrote this book for leaders specifically, because I think that while there is a lot that we individually can do, the amount of courage and fortitude it takes for an individual to raise their hand and say like, wow, we've exceeded our work in progress limit, or maybe we need to look at this differently, is a tremendous amount of courage and fortitude needed. There's a lot of courage needed for a leader as well to do that, but they are much more able to say, hey, group, we need to look at how we're choosing our work and how we're prioritizing it differently, right? We're going to do it together. And we need that from leaders, right? And, a leader who delegates a lot, say they've got 10 number one priorities and they just delegate it, they've still got 10 number one priorities, right? So that leader is flooded all the more with that competing priority and that multitasking, that context switching. And I think that we kind of look for any reason we can come up with to avoid the really hard work of prioritizing what comes next, what needs to get done next, not because we are lazy or don't care, but because it is really challenging. And if delegating worked, if multitasking worked, if making micro progress on lots of things all at the same time worked, that would be so much more convenient. And so we put a lot of energy into trying to make that work because it would be so much more convenient. And it keeps us from doing the really hard work of managing how much we pursue at a time and how we prioritize. And we need as coaches and as organizational leaders, we need to find kind of the path forward to helping leaders understand like how powerful it is for them to actually do that work, as opposed to just continuing to perpetuate the flood that we're all kind of swimming in.
A couple of things I want to explore before our time is the idea of performance, because I think part of the what you talk about in the book and is unlocking performance, and then the real flow, which we haven't talked about yet. But the idea of, if I'm working on all these things but nothing of them is complete really, but at the end of the week I'm seeing like this list of 10 things that I'm working on, maybe that gives me the sense of that I'm doing, I'm performing. I have 10 things that I'm working on at the same time. But let's say on the contrary, if I say, I'm at the end of the week, I only got one thing done, but it's done, it's fully done. I don't get that sense of just, I did something, because it's only one thing. So maybe if you could say a little bit about what have you found about performance? What do people think of performance? Does that play into having all these multitask work tasks up in the air and juggling multiple things to feel that they're that there's productivity or they're performing?
I think that performance is one of those things that we get wrong a lot. Like even the dictionary definition of performance says that it's about how you perform in relation to someone else. Like it's a competitive thing. And I read that and I think, what a low bar to set to only perform, like you only have high performance if you're doing better than your competitor, as opposed to like looking at what I think we need to be looking at more, which is performance over time. Like how do we sustain better outcomes over the long haul? And I think that comes all the way back to then when you look at a week, if you're only looking at a week and you only got one thing done versus making progress on 10 things, that feels a little imbalanced, right? I think one of the strategies that we can use as coaches and as leaders is we actually need to make our progress more visible so that we move out of just looking at a single week and we understand, okay, but what did I get done over a month or a quarter? And what was the value of each of those things that we got done? And we need to be able to see that progress. We need to make it more visible, like literally visible within our organization so that we can understand, are we making progress, right? Or are we just spinning our wheels on making, getting little bits done and lots of stuff, but nothing ever gets totally done? Or are we actually accomplishing real outcomes and understanding the impact that they're having and then, moving on to the next thing? So I think it is really important to expand our horizon when we're trying to understand performance and productivity. So we're not just looking at it in isolation. And so we can see the whole bigger picture of what's my part of the contribution, what's yours, how is that stacking up? And I think without that time horizon, we just have an artificial view and it doesn't really give us the information that we need, even though it feels like it might, right? It has the appearance. It's like you can tread water and you can swim across the lake and they both use up a tremendous amount of calories and they both feel like you're working hard. But treading water is not the same as swimming across the lake. And I think that's what happens, right? We're busy, we feel incredibly productive, or we feel that way, but we're not really making progress. We have to be able to see that progress. And in order to do that, we have to look at both the here and now and the longer term horizon of time.
And I think that's where I believe flow comes in, is looking at, how things are flowing, where are we stuck? What's causing that sort of stuckness? And so maybe you could spend a little bit of time on what is real flow? How do you describe this concept of real flow?
I think that flow is the experience of working hard with ease. It's this idea that you can work really hard and the movement is happening. That collaboration, while the problems you're trying to solve are challenging, collaboration feels effective. The work that we're doing, we can see the progress on it. We see the movement. Flow is about movement. The opposite of flow, I think, is flood. It's a flood. A flooded river has raging water, but if you're a boat in that river, you're not necessarily moving faster. You're getting stuck on rocks, and you can read the first chapter of the book for a very self-deprecating story of one experience that I had doing some kayaking down a super flooded river, right? The water moves faster, but you're not moving faster, even though it feels like it is. The river's raging. The other thing that can happen in a flood sometimes is the water entirely exceeds the boundaries and the banks of the river. And then it's just stagnant because the boundaries are gone and you have, a flooded landscape and nothing is moving. And I think that's also the opposite of flow. And that's what can happen. So flow is what happens when we are in control of how the work moves through our organization. It's when flood is when we feel out of control. Flow is what happens when we are in control of it, when we are really understanding what's the capacity that we have to pursue more than one thing at a time, right? I don't think it's about just doing one thing at a time. I don't think the answer is just a single task or never to multitask or to only have one initiative in progress. It's really about saying, what are the boundaries of our team? What are the boundaries of our organization in which we can pursue good work with flow and high quality and good outcomes? Every team, every individual, every team of teams has a natural boundary there, at which point when you exceed it, quality starts to suffer, humans start to suffer, outcomes start to suffer. So it's about finding what's our natural boundary. If you think about, yet another way to apply that ecosystem idea, so like the banks of a river, what are those boundaries of your ecosystem and your team? Choose that amount of work, get it done, and then pull in the next piece so that you're never in the situation where you are just bombarded and flooded by important work. It's not about doing less even. It's about starting less, right? Doing less at the same time so that you can get more done. And it's about choosing with intention what comes next so that we all know what that is. And working within those boundaries. And when we do that, we will find that, yeah, the water moves fast. The pace is still going to be fast. There's still going to be an abundance of important work to do, but we're not going to be out of control while we're doing it. And that's, I think, what flow is. And it's real flow because it has to work in reality. It can't just work on paper. If it doesn't work in a real organization with real people in reality, then it's not worth our time to explore, right? So it has to be real. It has to be grounded in reality. And it has to be grounded in the way we show up and work as humans. And that's when we really get that flow that is energetic, that builds, that helps us accomplish more than we thought was possible, where we really achieve that like level of performance together that is exponentially greater than what we could do on our own. I think that's what it's about. And I think that's possible for every organization and every team if they really honor their own boundaries and their own way of working as humans. I think we're capable of so much more than we most of the time realize, and that our expectations, it's not about lowering our expectations, are already too low. I think we need to actually raise our expectations on what we really are capable of. And then we'll experience that flow and we'll be in control of it, right? We choose where it goes and we're part of it as opposed to just being controlled by it and overwhelmed by it and burned out.
I gotta read that story now, though. How you mentioned about the boat in the river and the flood. I really like the metaphor, flooding, and even though on the other hand, like some organizations, which is probably not an example that I've seen a lot, but there's the drought. There's also like, the water is kind of like there's no more water.
You're just waiting.
Yeah, you're just waiting on things. But most organizations are flooded in my experience. They're trying to do more than they can handle, and it's like this raging river, as you described it, with people on the boat trying to manage getting to safety. And sometimes that is really hard, which causes a lot of anxiety. And like as you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, they're anxious because there's this thing that is kind of pushing them to do faster, more faster, and that will bring this sort of the anxiety and burnout.
And it just fuels, right? That's the cycle, right? It just fuels and it digs us deeper into it, and it's not going to lead to high performance, right? And I think that's the piece where sometimes we think about like a happy, healthy, engaged team as being a bonus. Like it's a nice to have. It's even great when we can do good work and be happy and healthy. And I would say like, it's not a bonus. It's the only path forward. It is the only path towards sustained high performance that really allows your organization to lead for the long haul. It's not something that we can choose one or the other. And when we choose one or the other, both are diminished. Right? They actually go hand in hand, and we have to continue pursuing and finding ways to work with our humanity and our human selves so that we can solve those really important problems and those complex problems that are needed. Otherwise, I think that we'll all suffer for it. And there's too much good work to be done to accept that kind of waste.
That's a great way to come to a landing here. Is there anything that you would like to point to or something that you want to share before we wrap up the conversation?
Yeah, well, I would love listeners to grab a copy of the book of Real Flow. It is written for leaders, but it's written for all of us who work with teams that we care about, and gives us all some tools to change the conversation, to have a little bit different conversation, and to consider reading it together with your team, because it's also the sort of thing that if you're the only one in a life raft trying to get everybody out of the flood, you're going to struggle and you probably will suffer, right? You're not going to be able to do that for long. And this work is really important. And so the more that we have shared language and shared stories and metaphors and visuals and things like that can help us, the more effective we're going to be. So with that, like I invite you to, I'm sure we'll include the link, check out the book page at Real Work Done, because I've got some really great team buy bonuses that are going on right now to celebrate the launch of the book and to really encourage teams to read it together. So would love for you to check those out, to get some tools and resources that can really empower you to be an influencer in your team and in your organization. And that would be my greatest hope, is that we're all building a few more tools and adding a few more stories to our toolkit so that we can have different kinds of conversations within the organizations that we work with and with the teams and leaders that we coach.
I definitely invite everyone to check out the book. It's on Amazon right now. It's pre-sales.
On Amazon, wherever you get your books. And if you check out realworkdone.com/book, you will see whatever the bonus. We've got some great bonuses as it's launching in October, but we'll will continue to have some really great incentives and bonuses to encourage groups and teams to read the book together. So you can check that out and jump right in with whatever that bonus is the month that you discover Real Flow.
I think it's a timely book, especially with the concepts on burnout cycle and the unlocking performance, and the how you define real flow is very clear and concise. And, a lot of teams and organizations can benefit from this. So thank you for sharing this insights. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Appreciate your time.
I have enjoyed this so much and really appreciate the conversation, and look forward to connecting with people who are listening and join part of the conversation. You can find me on my website. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and I would love to be connected there and have you be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brandi.
Hey, thank you for listening. I hope this conversation gave you something to think about or take action on. Remember, take action and get clarity, then repeat.